Well, thanks to the organizer for inviting me to give this paper. Actually, nudging me to even write this paper, which I've been thinking of for some time. But unless you get deadlines, you never get things done. And obviously, I stand between dinner and so we'll get this on quickly. So this is a paper that's joined with my postdoc Kriti Gujral. And as you can see, the title is, Does the Current Practice of Evidence-Based Medicine Breed Disparities? And obviously, whenever you say evidence-based medicine, there's a lot of commotion around it. There's a lot of action about what you mean by evidence-based medicine. And initially, the title was, Does Evidence-Based Medicine Breed Disparity? And I got a lot of flack for that, so I had to call and change the title and say current practice. I'll define what that is. I just wanted to start off saying, I believe evidence is valuable. This is not to say that evidence-based medicine is bad. So evidence is valuable because it does improve decision making. But the concept of evidence-based medicine, presumably developed in the 1990s, and in the literature I found the Guat name that originally formed this evidence-based medicine title, although I hear Chuck is actually working with him, which I didn't know when he kind of, I think, decided to discuss my paper. The evidence-based medicine kind of evolved over during the 1990s, and Sackett kind of described it as using the current best evidence from clinical care research in the management of individual patients. Although how EBM has really affected individual level decision making, I don't think it has ever been rigorously evaluated. And some have said that the usefulness in applying EBM to individual patients are limited. And the question that we wanted to ask here is that, has this failure led to disparities in outcome? And just to summarize, EBM, in the EBM world, randomized clinical trial is the king, and obviously randomization instills believability in the results. The primary focus here is what David Eddy had pointed out, this distinction is that there is an evidence-based guideline principles that are developed, EBG, versus evidence-based individualized decision making. And my focus is this whole idea of evidence-based guidelines, which I think primarily is evidence-based medicine. I mean, people talk about evidence-based individualized decision making, but I have yet to see it in actual practice, how it spans out. Obviously, the focus is on average effects, and we know that it doesn't apply to individual patients. Chuck has a whole body of work on that, and the key is that when you use these results for individual patients, you incur both type 1 and type 2 errors. Now, when these research is done, we control for population level type 1 and type 2 errors, but at the individual level, you're still having type 1 and type 2 errors. And if you follow the results, the average results, you may be able to maximize a population outcome with standardization of care. But the question really is the distribution of type 1 and type 2 errors affect certain groups, whether it's race, ethnic group, ethnicity-based groups, or over time. And if they do, then the idea would be that we would expect that this would lead to disparities in outcomes. So I will start off with a motivating example. Obviously, we all know type 2 diabetes is one of the most common chronic diseases of our times, and the prevalence is about 8.3 per 100 person. And in the 1990, 2000 and onwards, the prevalence have continued to increase, and these are percentage changes, annual percentage changes, although it has slowed down in the recent time. But if you look at incidence, diabetes incidence, this was increasing at about 5% per year during the 1990 and early 2000, and started declining after 2000 at 5% rate. And this has been kind of talked about as success, in the whole literature, that how we have curbed the tide of diabetes incidence in this country. However, if you look at the these incidence rate among non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks, and Hispanics. What you see is that for Hispanic, non-Hispanic whites, that their trends is very similar to the overall trend. Obviously, they are 70% of the population. But for non-Hispanic blacks and Hispanics, there were no declines happening during this time. So there's a huge disparity of diabetes incidence that's happening. Now, we actually got these results much after we started working on diabetes because we were hoping we will estimate it from the data. Apparently, I asked some folks at CDC, like, do you have this data? And they said, oh, we published a paper on this. And they sent me this paper where we got this, and then we asked, like, why do you think this is the case? Because they have all sorts of answers about why overall diabetes incidence has been declining, but they didn't have any answer as to why they were not declining for these populations. So, so before we go about, I just wanted to present some theoretical kind of discussions about what we think, of the evidence generation process is kind of imparts to this whole realization of outcomes in the real world, and a very, very rough kind of overview of this is that, in the population, we have some prior information at some point about the benefits of certain treatments, right? Whether it's a preventative treatment or kind of curative treatment. But there's a lot of uncertainty in the prior information, and so we want to do this big RCT to kind of resolve the uncertainty. So based on this prior information, individual patients and their physicians kind of decide whether to enroll in these trials in RCT. Right? And people enroll, and this is a selection mechanism of enrolling. Based on that enrollment, there is an average treatment effect that's estimated from the RCT. The average treatment effect is then popularized by EBM, by clinical guidelines, and that affects, that gets combined with prior information, and now the patients in the real world population are making treatment selection based on that result, the combination of their prior information and the EBM. And they make treatment selection in the real world, and the outcomes are realized in the real world. So that's a very simple kind of process of kind of generating evidence and how it leads to treatment selection and outcomes of the population. But as you can see, if you were to, theoretically, you can write down various models. I'm going to show you some of that. But empirically, just to study this whole process requires a richness of data that's often just not available. I mean, as Jace showed us, there's a lot of data you can pull and scrap from to really get a story, and these kind of stories are very difficult to tell. But we will do our best. So here is the setup. Consider basically a scalar risk, theta, representing a set of factors over, say, the true treatment effects vary. And this theta could be anything. It could be biological age. It could be a set of factors that represent something about the health of the patient that is predictive of outcomes. And in this case, we can scale the theta to have a mean of 0. And suppose the true benefits of a treatment compared to a control or compared to an alternative treatment in the population is given by E theta, and it's normally distributed, and the mean is, this is the average treatment effect, alpha 1, and the heterogeneity is given by this, which is alpha 2 times theta. So as theta changes, the average effect, conditional average treatment effect changes. And suppose somehow the perception of incremental benefits actually in the population, there is uncertainty, is given by the true value plus some error term. Now, if we were thinking about completely novel treatments, I would say that the perception is like constant. It's like not around the true value. But what we are dealing with here is our treatments that are already in practice, although there is a lot of uncertainty around it. And so, so there is some information out there about what works and what doesn't work. But there's a lot of noise around it. So that's what we are talking about. So that's the benefit side, but there is also a cost side to this when we are thinking about decisions. And here the costs are of treatment, for this case, are the total cost are the demand price what they pay to get the treatment, plus some shadow cost of getting the treatment. And these shadow costs could be the access cost, the distance they have to travel to the clinic to get a treatment, and all sorts of things. And this cost are subscripted with a J, which is RCT, or outside. So the cost within the trial versus the cost outside the trial. And the key thing, if you write down a simple kind of discrete choice model of selecting into the trial, you have this random utility model where the random utility to select in the trial depends on the expected benefits from within the trial minus the expected benefits from outside the trial. So from within the trial, a person kind of perceives this benefit given their theta times the randomization probability that they are only going to get the treatment with certain probability within the trial, minus the cost of kind of enrolling the trial and cost of getting the treatment in the trial. So this is the expected net benefits from the trial, minus the expected net benefits outside the trial, so that this person can also get that same treatment outside the trial and get the same perceived benefits, but it may cost differentially. So it's basically the difference between the two things. And what this shows is that the probability of enrollment in the trial depends on whether the perceived benefits are less than the difference in the cost of getting the treatment outside versus inside the trial. And you can then transfer that based on the true benefits, and you can say that the probability of enrolling in the RCT depends on the true benefits, the differential cost of access, and the noise in perceived benefits. Right? And what this results is that if you think that we are trying to get after the average treatment effect of the population, the average treatment effect on the RCT, the target parameter itself would not be the average treatment effect in the population. It would be a weighted average of the true benefits, weighted by the probability of enrollment. And so the RCT would depend on not only the product of the two means here, but also the covariance between the enrollment probability and the true benefits. So if folks who are likely to get more benefit from treatment are also the folks who are least likely to enroll in the trial, you get an RCT, average effect in RCT, that's lower than the average true population effect. Right? And this is shown basically in this stylized diagram. You have these, the benefits curve, and this is the x-axis is theta, which is risk, and you have the cost curve, and the cost of accessing is increasing at a faster rate over theta than benefits. People with higher risk have difficulty accessing treatment for various reasons, right? And what you see is that the individuals who truly realize higher benefit, these ones are the ones that fail to enroll, and these are the ones that would, based on this, would be taking treatment. And so here the average treatment effect in the RCT would be less than the population. And similarly, in another situation, it could be the other way around. So that's kind of in both cases, as theta increases, the probability of enrollment increases, but in one case, the treatment effect from the RCT is more than the population, in the other case, it's less than the population. And you can do other stylized version of this too. So now people have enrolled, we have gotten RCT, we have gotten average treatment effect out, but now the EBM process takes this average effect and kind of says, okay, here's the clinical guideline, here's the average effect, this treatment works or this treatment doesn't work, right? And so if we have a draw from that ATE RCT, one result from one clinical trial, the updated beliefs after EBM issues guidelines is given by the weighted average of what the prior belief was and what the RCT results were, right? And based on that, you can see that the mean of the updated beliefs is given by the weighted average between the two, and it depends on whether the ATE RCT is less than or more than the population average. The mean of the new perceived benefits would change in one way or the other. But perhaps the most important fact is that whatever that result is, propagating one average treatment effect actually mitigates or attenuates the perception of heterogeneity that could have existed before, just by learning by doing or using the physicians may have used this and saw like this works for certain people and this does not work for certain people. And now suddenly a big trial comes out and says this works. And so your heterogeneity in perception kind of gets shrinks to the middle towards the average treatment effect. And that has implications for how then after EBM, people keeps using this treatment in the population. So for example, in this case, if you write down another discrete model now to say, let's see who would receive treatment after the EBM is done. So in the ideal situation, with complete information, you would say that they would make the choice based on the true benefits and the cost, right? And this would be their kind of probability of choosing, and this would be the realized benefit. So the realized benefit would be integration of all the true benefits given they have chosen treatment. But after EBM, the individuals choose treatment not based on the true benefits, but obviously based on their updated perceived benefits. And so you can plug in those formula and say, these are the ones. This is how they choose treatment, and as a result, this is what will be realized in the population. But both the probability of treatment choice and the realized population would then depend on the sign of how the treatment effect changes over theta, how the cost changes over theta, and whether the RCT ATE is less or greater than the true population average treatment effect. And let me show you why that's the case. So here you have a stylized example where the true benefits decreases and the cost is increasing over theta. And ideally, you would say, okay, these are the people who would take the treatment because E is greater than C, and these are the people who shouldn't take the treatment. After EBM, what happens in this setting, if the cost is increasing, we expect the average treatment effect to be higher than the population average treatment effect, right? But as a result, the perceived benefits becomes not only the average becomes higher, but the variability gets attenuated. So it kind of shifts over theta. And as a result, now the people who are choosing are up to here. So these are the people who are choosing. And so in this setting, when alpha 2 is negative, which is the slope of this E line, DC is positive, slope of this line, and ATE RCT is greater than alpha, which is you're overestimating ATE, you're saying that the realized benefit is actually more than the optimal benefits, although there is a deadweight loss because a lot of people are using this that shouldn't be using this. And so there is an increase of people using a treatment that they shouldn't be using it. Right? The key measure here, though, the key for the purpose of this paper, the point that we wanted to make is that any change in this realized benefit would vary by subgroups of people as long as the distribution of theta are different for different two groups. If the distribution of risk are different for two different groups, and you're publishing one average treatment effect based on which people are making decisions, you would actually end up realizing different outcomes for those different groups of people. And that would create disparity over time. Another example is, and I chose the example because of the empirical example that we'll show later, is where we have, again, the average, the alpha 2 is positive, which means the true benefits are increasing over theta. The costs are also increasing, but not increasing at a faster rate. And in this case, all the higher risk people are going to choose this treatment and not the lower risk, an ideal setting. But in this setting also, the ATE would be lower than the average treatment effect. So with EBM, this perceived line over theta would be lower and obviously attenuated. And as a result, a lot less people are going to choose this. And interestingly, only the lower risk are choosing it, not the higher risk who should be choosing it. So it creates enormous differences in incentive about who should be getting the treatment and how they should be using it. Okay? So this is kind of the summary of the theory that we found, is that obviously decision making and realized benefits are affected in various ways: enrollment, RCT, EBM promotion, average effects, and then how that influence treatment selection. And they all can vary over some underlying risk over there is treatment effect heterogeneity. And as long as there are two groups of people with different distribution of that underlying risk, even if their benefits profile, the production function is exactly the same, you would still end up with the same different realized outcomes in the population. So let's now look at type 2 diabetes. So what I want to talk about is the major trial that looked at diabetes prevention, the EBM recommendations that came out of it, some applicability in the population, risk and heterogeneity and effects, enrollment, treatment selection, outcomes, and disparities. And I'm going to, I guess, finish that on all in 15 minutes. But as you can see, I mean, there are so many steps to this, and it's very difficult sometimes to kind of really study these in a real setting, because you have to have that data to link across all these different parts of selection and outcomes. So DPP enrolled patients from late 90s to early 2000, randomly assigned about 3,000 non-diabetic patients with elevated fasting and post-load plasma glucose concentrations, basically those who are at risk of developing diabetes in a few years. And they were randomized to placebo, metformin, which is a drug, and a lifestyle modification program with the goals of at least 7% weight loss, at least 150 minutes of physical activity per week. And the main results with 3 years of follow-up was that the incidence of diabetes was 11%, 7%, and 5% per 100 person years in placebo, metformin, lifestyle. Basically, lifestyle was far more better than anything else. Metformin was okay, was better than placebo, but nowhere near what lifestyle is. This created an enormous change in practice patterns in not only the United States and many other countries. DPP was in every clinical guideline. Even right now, Medicare has started programs to pay for national DPP program. Results were published in 2002. Here's a recommendation that came out just after following DPP, published in 2003 by American Diabetes Association. They went through everything. They said patients with IGT should be given counseling on weight loss, as well as instruction for increasing physical activity with an A grade. Drug therapy should not be routinely used to prevent diabetes until more information is known about its cost effectiveness, which is interesting because typically we don't see cost effectiveness mentioned in clinical guidelines. So that was the recommendation. So what did so before I say let me see. So in terms of the heterogeneity results, the DPP did find some heterogeneous effects, although that didn't really follow through with the main ADA recommendation. Lifestyle actually was better for most groups, except for a few groups where metformin and lifestyle were very similar. For younger people, 25 to 44, there was no significant difference. For African Americans, there were no significant difference. And for body mass index greater than 35, so really obese people, there were no, actually metformin is doing slightly better, but there was no significant difference. So what did come out of that? Another kind of publication said in DPP, metformin was about half as effective as diet and exercise in delaying diabetes, but it was so on average it was half as effective, which is true. It was nearly ineffective in older adults and those with who are less overweight. Conversely, metformin was as effective with individuals with younger people and high obesity, just from the subgroup analysis. But as you can see, if you translate this to a kind of a joint distribution table, where it says that I'm very clear about these cells, that lifestyle is better, Lifestyle or metformin both could work in these cells, and I don't know what's going on here. It's unclear, right? So these kind of marginal cell subgroup analysis often does not translate to kind of actual decision making where a patient would belong in one of these cells actually. Yeah. So again, as you said, metformin is ineffective in overweight, less than overweight, but as equally effective with younger patients. So if a younger patient with less than 30 comes to your office, you don't know exactly which one is effective or more effective. So let me talk about the cost-effectiveness study. The cost-effectiveness study that followed that, assumed DPP lifestyle intervention and metformin costs the same. It was an assumption. And although metformin actually went generic after that, it found lifestyle intervention to be cost-effective from healthcare and societal perspective, and there are all sorts of issues about using 1/3 of a wage to wait time and all those kind of things. And we know that the DPP intervention required about 135 visit hours. The visit time was about 3.5 times higher than metformin in terms of. So if you think about an access cost, lifestyle intervention had a lot more access cost than getting the drug. So what happened is that in 2015, which is about 13 years later, this group of people from Tufts started actually reanalyzing the data of DPP. And they kind of came from the idea that average doesn't work, we should look at heterogeneity. And so what they did is they developed a prediction tool, much like the biological age tool, where they put in a lot of the baseline information in DPP in the placebo group to see what predicts overall diabetes incidence. So that they came up with a risk model, which says a combination of these factors is predicting a risk that is predictive of diabetes incidence. It's a very descriptive prediction of baseline risk. And they use that baseline risk. Here's a distribution of the baseline risk within the DPP trial. And they showed that the treatment effect for lifestyle and metformin as a function of that baseline risk. This is kind of chopped up into different quartiles. And what you can see on the y-axis, this is the average risk reduction. Lifestyle compared to placebo has really a kind of monotonic, here you can think alpha 2 is positive compared to, this is the risk and this is alpha 2, the true benefits is going up. Metformin also has an alpha 2 positive. But if you look between lifestyle and metformin, metformin was not as good in the lower quartile, but it's not significantly different from each other from the higher quartile. So one could say that the alpha 2 between lifestyle and metformin is actually decreasing over theta. So it is an alpha 2 is negative when you compare lifestyle to metformin. So basically it says that higher risk people are actually equally likely to benefit from metformin than lifestyle. So that was the idea. So what we did was we kind of took that model and we started looking at the enhanced data to understand how is the population looks like in terms of this risk, the same risk equation compared to the RCT trial. Right? And we could only look from 2005 onwards because all the nuanced biomarkers that they used were only available collected from 2005, which was not that far. It was 3 years after the DPP was published and 2 years after the ABM results came out. So we applied all the exclusion inclusion, most of the important exclusion inclusion criteria of the DPP trial. We found the at-risk population, which was we found about 2,100 people, which was represented about 22 million nationally, or 7.5% of the US population from the enhanced data. And we now wanted to see what happens. So here is the distribution of over 2005 to 2012. The blue line was the distribution in DPP, and these histograms are the distribution of the same risk factor among whites, Mexican American, and blacks. And the reason we did Mexican Americans and we are updating everything to just Hispanics is because there was one paper we found that did metformin use by Mexican Americans. We started doing it with Mexican Americans, stuck to it. So we got to update that. But as you can see, there is not much difference. I mean, the distribution in the DPP looks very similar to the distribution of risk in the population, which is first of all fascinating because DPP was one of the larger studies, and with larger clinical trial, you would expect that maybe the selection would not be a bigger problem. Maybe it will be a bigger problem with smaller cancer trials. But what's interesting about this is that if we look at by year, we see that over time from 2005, the white distribution, which is green, stays very similar to the DPP population, but the Mexican American and blacks have a shift to the right side. Which means that even if the average treatment effect, there was no selection problem, and the average treatment effect on the DPP applied to this population, over time, it ceases to apply to this population because the risk has shifted out. Right? In fact, if you look at the 75th percentile from the DPP, so 25% of the DPP is above that, and over time you will find the whites actually stay down, but the Mexican Americans and the blacks, actually the probability of risk above that cutoff is increasing over time. Lastly, this is just a descriptive statistics. I showed you about what the EBM kind of recommended, and whether it's unclear. And here is a distribution by those three racial groups where they fall. And you can see that if you think about clear-cut evidence that lifestyle should be used in these cells, for whites it was 51%, Mexican Americans it was 37%, blacks it was 32%. So I guess there is a lot of treatment ambiguity for one group versus another based on the recommendation. Finally, we talk about treatment selection after EBM. So EBM was calculated, and if you remember, for exercise versus metformin, we found that alpha-2 was negative. Metformin was gaining ground on lifestyle as we go over theta. We assumed that delta C and delta theta would be 0. The more risky people, for various reasons, have larger cost to access any treatment. And we know under this condition, the average treatment effect would be greater than alpha because for later than 2005, more people, there are slightly high risk people where metformin is slightly better, and so on average, if you get the DPP results, exercise seems optimistic in that sense. And what the theory says is that under the ideal situation, the probability of exercise use should decrease over theta, and compared to ideal situation, more people would be induced to use exercise with EBM, and more so for higher theta. So not only would you expect that treatment exercise use should be declining with theta, although if you just go with the plain result, you would expect, with higher theta, exercise effects are much bigger, so more people should be using it. But according to theory, you would expect that the exercise use should be declining, and with higher theta, they should be ideally declining much faster, but it's not declining fast enough. And the reason is that you want people to switch to metformin with a higher theta because metformin is almost equally good at that point. And similarly for metformin and placebo is our scenario 2, where alpha-2 is increasing over theta. DC theta we again assume to be 0 or positive, and the average treatment effect from the RCT is less than the true effect. And in this ideal situation, we would expect that metformin should increase over theta, but compared to ideal situation, people are induced to use metformin at the lower, and the higher risk people are not induced to use metformin because the RCT has propagated a lower mitigated effect of metformin. So what do we see in actual result? We don't have an enhance indicator for DPP enrollment. I mean, it's just not there. So what we used as a proxy was moderate to vigorous physical activity. And over this time, if I do the actual estimate of what proportion of the population used this, had any moderate to vigorous activity, you see that they are declining over the over the risk. We couldn't go beyond because the sample size just decreased and we couldn't get a reliable estimate. But for metformin, you would see that, yeah, there is slightly increasing, although we would expect more here, but it's not increasing much. I mean, it's hardly increasing. If you look at the decline here, you would expect that if it declines here, it should have picked up here, but you don't see that that's happening. So people are not using metformin, although they're reducing exercise. In fact, if we look at what happens by race, we see, and again, the race, you would expect if the cost function is higher, or the DC d theta is higher for blacks than the whites, you would see that this decline would be faster for blacks and the Mexican Americans. So that's what we see. But interestingly, even though we see this decrease, we don't see a commensurate increase in the metformin side by these patients. And to what extent, this could be, we don't evaluate to what extent you could have overcome this by doing purely, heterogeneous treatment effects and really EBM based on heterogeneity treatment effects. But what we do find is this figure, which was published in the JAMA, is that during this period, up to 2008, everything was moving, diabetes incidence was moving up for all the groups. And then starting from 2008, it took a sharp turn for the whites, but not for the other groups. And there is no clear explanation about why that happened. And if you look at the difference, like what was the growth in disparity during this time? This was about, difference was about 4 per 1,000, and this is about 7. So the growth in disparity was about 3 extra people per 1,000 was getting diabetes among the minority groups compared to whites, right? And if we just want to estimate how much of the disparity we could have avoided if we had given not only individualized treatment recommendation, but just from the fact that over time the tails of the minority distribution shifted to the right. Not the overall average effect of heterogeneous EBM, but just the marginal effect of heterogeneous EBM for only those people who shifted to the right, for the minority group, the extra people. And if we calculate, we'll see, probably if we just do a back of the envelope calculus, it comes out to be, we can explain about 6% of this difference just from the fact that that small proportion, 10% of the people, shifted over time toward the high quartile effect. All right, so I just wanted to point out that this is the 2008 guidelines, and it's not very different after 16 years. Yet I'm done, right?
No, you have a few minutes.
So it's not much different from what it was like 16 years ago. They still have those age less than 60, BMI greater than 35. Now it has long-term use of metformin may be associated with vitamin 12 deficiency, so just take vitamin 12 medicine, I guess, tablet. And then a cost-effectiveness model suggested the lifestyle intervention was cost-effective. This is the 2003 reference, so there was no cost-effectiveness done since then on this. And so it's fairly slow-moving enterprise, really not kind of understanding, all the data that has collected in the real world over time and using that to make a recommendation. So I think, obviously we need evidence for decision making and evidence production and dissemination infrastructure, could lead to suboptimal outcomes because there are enrollment issues, change in distribution over time, propagation of the average effect, and not accounting for the shadow price of accessing treatment. So even if you think something is good, if you impose that and actually nobody uses it, you can actually get lower results. And I think what we found here is that all of those factors, if you could index them with some baseline risk, and those baseline risk distributions different in different groups, you would end up with disparate outcomes in the population. And you would think that you have done everything to the book and followed EBM guidelines, and you still end up with disparate outcomes. And hopefully, I don't know when, but hopefully someday we'll have much more better risk-tailored EVM in practice. Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. I'm going to mostly use Anirban's paper as a way to stimulate some talk about some of the general themes more than the details of what he talked about. I want to apologize. There are several people here who were at a seminar I gave yesterday at the Schaefer Center who there's going to be some overlap between what I say today and what I said then. There are a couple of sources. There's a review article I wrote in Health Economics, a reasonable patient care under uncertainty, and there's even much more discussion of this in there. And there's even much more discussion, but you can't see it yet, in this book. It's actually not personalized. I removed that from the title in the end. The final title is just Patient Care Under Uncertainty, that is now into production at Princeton University Press. So I'm going to talk about these general themes about wishful extrapolation of trial findings to patient care. I'm going to use Anirban's paper to give some examples. I was going to say a word about, yeah, it's true, the original version he sent me a few weeks ago was, it was a work in progress. And the slides you presented today are, I'm getting a much better sense of how it all fits together from the slides. Let me say to the rest of you, there are two pieces in this. There's a very precise structural model of enrollment and trials and decision-making of who decides to enroll or not, and then and how people use the information produced by trials to make decisions. This is a real, for economists, this is what we like to see, a real structural economic exercise. I can hardly imagine what Gordon Guyat or the other evidence-based medicine people would think of this. It would be totally foreign to them, but it's still what we should be doing. The second part, of course, is all about diabetes. It's just a wealth of information about the DPP trial and about trends in diabetes in general. And I can see, what I can see in the slides that I wasn't so clear of a few weeks ago was how the material on diabetes fits with the theoretical model. I can see that it's moving in that way. So that's really good. So let me talk about what Anirban began with, but the kind of the general mindset in the work on evidence-based medicine. So you can use evidence-based sounds good, but you can use evidence but not use it in a particularly good way. So it's like a nice soundbite to say that you're evidence-based. And of course, it's not just medicine; it's evidence-based education, evidence-based everything these days. But the problem is, particularly regarding randomized trials, that although randomized trials are supposed to be the gold standard and all of that, there's a huge number of problems with the practice of randomized trials in medicine, and I just want to go through some of those. And of course, as I'm sure everybody knows, part of it is this elevation of all trials here and then observational studies way down here, and things are really sort of out of whack. And the basic things I want to focus on is extrapolation from trials. I've taken to calling it wishful extrapolation from trials to patient care, or in other words, it's the problem of external validity, just to use other terminology. Now, what Anirban's paper is basically focused about is a problem of extrapolation from study populations to real patient populations. I want to make a couple of comments about that. One, which is not the focus of this paper, but is a big deal, is the use of inclusion-exclusion criteria regarding comorbidities in trials. This is so the trials are run on just certain kinds of patients, and they're just not run on other kinds of patients. To take an exam, and then this leads problems for guideline developers, because you only have trials run on certain kinds of people, but you really want to make guidelines for the full patient population. In the DPP trial that's in Anirban's paper, I looked at the information he provided. It, of course, excluded patients with diabetes at baseline. It's for pre-diabetic patients. But then, but there are other people excluded. Recent myocardial infarction symptoms, I mean, that's a kind of, that doesn't happen. Symptoms of coronary heart disease, well, that's excluding a lot of people, I assume. Serious illness or use of medications known to impair glucose tolerance. I don't have a strong sense, I'm not an MD, so I don't know a strong sense how important these exclusion criteria are, but they're there and they're in every trial. What Anirban's paper is about the other aspect of it, which is the trial is performed on people who volunteer. And so the kind of a key point, which lots of us have been I've been ranting about this for years, and lots of people have been ranting about this, is that you can get an average treatment effect in the trial, but for the study population, it may be different than the patient population. And the real question is whether the distribution of treatment response in the study population is different than in the patient population. What's really absolutely new from the perspective of the evidence-based medicine literature is that Anirban has a formal model of this, and I could give him a lot of trouble about very specific assumptions in his model. I could do that very easily. The only one, you make very specific, I'm always looking at expectational assumptions, and you assume that people's perceptions of the, are truth plus white noise, and then you also assume afterwards, after the trial's published, that the sort of posterior expectations are a weighted average of the prior and what you get from the trial. And we could probably, there's not much we know about these things, right? And so I think it's valuable just to write down the model and even and take a stand on particular, and then crank out what the implications would be. But the fact is, the evidence-based medicine literature doesn't have a clue on who's actually participating in the trials. And a big problem is this, and I'll take this as an example, take like in the DPP, what do we know about the composition of the subjects who were invited to participate in this trial, but who chose not to participate? What do we know about that in any trial context? The data that we get is only about people who participate. If you really want to study the decision to participate and purposeful selection, then you've got to have data on the people who don't participate, who could have, but don't. We just don't have that, as far as I know, in the entire literature. So that's I think a big problem. Does this matter? Should we worry about the issue about volunteering or not? It depends on your staff. So for everyone in social science, and I think for some of the medicine people, well, they rely on Campbell's primacy of internal validity, that RCTs, are internally valid, and they give you a good estimate in the study population. And, I think most people here know that Don Campbell was very aware of the problem of external validity or extrapolation, but he said internal validity comes first. And in the medical literature, it gets phrased in a different way as the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. It's kind of the code words there. But it makes no sense for any of us who worry about heterogeneity in treatment response. The idea that internal validity comes first and external validity is a secondary matter makes no sense at all. It makes sense only if treatment response is homogeneous. Okay? And because you just can't make the argument otherwise. You've got to look both at the internal and the external validity. Okay, so that's on that issue, and that's what the focus of Anirban's paper is. I want to say, just in the tiny bit of time I have left, just very quickly say there are other issues with RCTs beyond the difference between the study population and the patient population. One is that the nature of treatments in RCTs is different than the nature of treatments in practice. One issue that's well known is that with drug trials, and we have with the metformin, we have a drug treatment here. They're double blinded in RCTs, and clinicians do not double blind. I don't know whether Jay or anyone clinician in practice, do you ever double blind your prescriptions? Does a patient go into a pharmacist and have the pharmacist say with probability 0.5 you're getting metformin, and with probability 0.5 you're getting placebo? That of course doesn't happen. And so the problem of extrapolation from double-blinded experiments, treatments to the real world is, could be important. And there's also another issue which shows up in the DPP, is that patients may get more intensive attention in trials. The adherence, coming in for clinic visits. I think particularly the example I used from an Anirban's paper is the intensive program of lifestyle modification that requires so many hours. Patients are probably prodded to come in. I think you said it was 135 hours. That's a lot of time. And in the trial, they may do it one way, but in the real world, there'd be much less adherence to this. Okay, so that's another issue that generally, that it shows up in extrapolating from trials to practice. Very quickly, I think everyone's aware of this. I'll just mention it. Is the issue of surrogate outcomes. It's not so bad in the diabetes thing because at least the outcome that was measured is onset for diabetes. It's not like reduction in blood pressure or control of cholesterol, which are much worse as surrogate outcomes. The problem in the DPP is basically is the short time span. Is the diabetes being chronic long disease? I think you said it was. I wrote here 3 to 6 years, but on your slide you said they were followed on average
3 years, 2.8 years.
2.8 years, so it's even.
Whether
yeah.
they develop diabetes within that time.
Yeah, so there is still this issue of a surrogate outcome that you're not following people nearly
Yeah,
as
but once
much.
they develop diabetes, they have diabetes. Basically.
Yeah,
So
but
that's
yeah. So there's that. I have a quote here from a paper disregarding cancer drugs and the problem of surrogate outcomes in cancer drugs. You can just read that if you want. Since I only have a short time, I'm going to stop here. I could go off on a rant about misuse of meta-analysis, but some of you heard that yesterday, so I'm not going to repeat that here. I'll just stop.
I just wanted to mention, that I was expecting some heat on the model from you, but the structural model for perception was the most hard to come up with, and the only reason I kind of made it around the true benefits is because this is not a novel, completely new treatment. It exists in the population when the RCT started, so doctors have been using it, but they might have some perception about what works and what doesn't work. And in another model, I also made the error term to be heteroscedastic with respect to theta, right? And so it's not only people have noise, but the noise actually changes with respect to theta. I think the most of the results go through. Still, it just makes it way more complicated.
I don't know. What I would probably say is what I say always about it when you're trying to understand decision making under uncertainty, that rather than making assumptions about expectations and then how people revise their expectations, is to go measure them, go collect data. And I think that would this question, trying to understand who is it that chooses to enroll in the experiment in an RCT, and also the other aspect, which I think is very important, is how the reporting of results on the trial, how not just the patients, but how the clinicians, how the whole world update their expectations after observing the results of the new trial. We just don't know much about that. And I think we really should try to measure the expectations.
The other thing I want to point out that in this case, I was going in finding that people who enrolled in the DTP trial, when I compare the risk in the actually enhanced population, which is nationally representative data, that I would find different distribution of risk. It turns out that the distribution overall for all those years is very similar. But what happened is over time, so at the time of the DPP was conducted, I think the distribution, there was a fairly good enrollment. But over time, the distribution in the real world population shifted. So even if at that time the trial did all it can, the effect still doesn't apply later on. So that was interesting.
Thanks. Okay. So I had a comment and a question. So the comment actually a little bit related to what I was asking Dr. Manski yesterday, or comment, is that so in the title of your paper you mentioned that it's current practice of evidence-based medicine as sort of like to smooth over the message. But in fact, there's like a large initiative from NIH to get a panel of 1 million people biomarkers. So if that's used to get a more widely representative basis for drawing clinical trials, so than just using people who are already plugged in, and could say, could provide a more hopeful message that maybe the the community could buy into a little bit more.
Well, let me respond to that. I think, you know, researchers have been doing studies to get to heterogeneity for a long, long time. It's not transpiring into actual recommendations because clinicians do not want to kind of go through all that list of them figuring out unless it's a very specific thing. And I think that's the problem that you have to, even the data production infrastructure, like if you have 200 subgroups that you need to deal with, right? You cannot do a randomized, like traditional randomized trial to deal with 200 subgroups. You need a hypothesis generation framework, then you might need to do an RCT where you allocate people based on that algorithm versus not test, right? So it's a different, so you know, in overall we need a different view of how to produce information.
Actually, that was a stated goal in studies, personalized medicine. So we'll see if that happens.
Yeah.
But then my other question / comment was, so you found that the DPP recruited people that were very similar to the overall population, and it was an interesting finding because not only would randomized trial would get people who are more plugged in to maybe tertiary medical centers or whatever it is, but also they get treatment for free, whereas in practice DPP is not covered by insurance a lot of the time. So maybe those two things can cancel out. Probably more vulnerable is the less vulnerable population benefit, not such a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean the similarity was only towards when DPP was conducted, right? And as you show, as we go along, this risk distribution changed. The risk distribution changed differentially for blacks and Mexican Americans than whites. The white distribution still remains similar to DPP. I absolutely agree. The cost, DPP was covered. Now in the real world, people have to pay to get in the DPP, and that kind of changed. So it was, I think, a good assumption to say that as risk increases, the cost actually increases over time, because not over time but over theta, because people who have in this case more comorbidities, more other issues, may have difficulty in paying out of their pocket and accessing the treatment. So that kind of conforms with the assumptions that we made about.
Yeah, I have two questions, both I think coming from a position of relative ignorance. The first one is about physicians and how they use these guidelines. So how much do physicians, you may not know the answer, but how much do they use observational studies? Not just necessarily ones kind of published in JAMA or something like that, but also just within kind of their own studies within the organization or something like that. The reason I'm thinking is that potentially, those studies are complementary as these trials are less and less representative.
Well, Jay might be able to say more about. I think there's a huge variability of treatment use across physicians. And part of the reason is that people have their physicians bring in their own preferences for certain things. First of all, second, I think there is evidence, and I have worked on it on pharmaceuticals, that physicians learn by doing. They learn from the outcomes of the patient over time. And the treatment effect on treated is often different from the average treatment effect. But I think it's an empirical question, as Chuck was mentioning, that when a big trial comes in and says, okay, this is good, this is on average, this is better, how much of that stock of information that they generated by clinical practice goes away? I don't know the answer to that. That would be an interesting question.
Yeah, and I guess it matters even more now since physician incentives are more and more tied to specific guidelines than they used to be in practice.
Exactly.
The second question is really simple. For RCTs, when kind of selecting in, do patients get kind of financial incentives to join? It's just like something.
I think ethically you cannot.
That's
the
right.
IRB board says, that you cannot pay them. You can pay a little bit of their time during the interviews, but you cannot pay them to actually join the trial. But there are so many other costs involved, and these trials happen in academic settings mostly, and so the distance to the trial, they are more protocol driven, so they have more number of visits if you join the trial. So there's a time cost involved.
Yeah, I was thinking more of the selection aspect, just the typical thing that.
Yeah, but
you
the
could give
selection
everyone
is
money.
huge because in many clinical trials they would select healthier patients just because
I
researchers would think that they would get a better result.
Purposely, I
Or vice
understand.
versa.
Yeah, that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
That's what other issue. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
So you just, I like the point you made about physician learning. I also was thinking, would it be useful to compare and contrast the diabetes example with another disease that is faster progressing, like cancer? Because, and I think that there are a couple of points embedded in this. One is that, as you noted, an alternative way to produce information is empirical treatment and observation mitigation. That's particularly useful when it's a slow progressing disease and you have time to fail. And also when you have a disease in which you have a relatively well understood ranking of treatments that vary in risk. Like in diabetes, lifestyle intervention is pretty safe. Metformin, then if that fails, you go to metformin, which is a very old drug with a long safety record. And then if you need to fail, you go to a branded drug. But in cancer, you have lots of potentially risky alternatives. It's not so, and if you make a mistake, the patient might be dead.
Well, I think the learning is more in that sense, don't you think? Because the learning doesn't happen within a patient. But if patient dies, you have a much stronger signal whether it works or not. So
Helps
the
the
next
doctor,
stage
but not
helps the
the
doctor. Yeah.
patient.
And in terms of learning, in terms of physician learning, I think it's
Right.
much faster.
Well, but I think from the patient's welfare standpoint,
Yeah.
what I want the doctor to do in diabetes is different than I think what I want the doctor to do in cancer. In cancer, I want the doctor to be just Johnny on the spot with all the trials. In diabetes, I kind of don't mind just progressing and seeing what
I mean, the
works.
welfare impact would depend on the cost or the benefits of learning, right? If you think overall learning has huge benefits, then just being agnostic and looking at learning faster from failing today's patients could recuperate because tomorrow's patients will get much better treatment. And
Unless there's a
overall
ton of
welfare is high.
heterogeneity.
Exactly.
Right? Which is
Exactly.
another-
Yeah.
But I think it might be useful just to parse out these various
Yeah.
issues that change the relative value of learning from treating patients versus the trial.
I mean, I must say, the biggest challenge with this is the data, because not only getting the exclusion inclusion right to get to the target population is a big challenge. I mean, I've been trying to get an instrument for enrolling in a clinical trial. I've been trying to do distance, but I don't have there's no data where you have individual patients' residences and where the trial was conducted, so I can use distance as an instrument whether they enrolled in the trial or not. And then I can figure out the treatment of heterogeneity within the trial and the population is
Why
compared.
not use the sites of the PMIs?
I could use that, but I don't know the actual zip code for people, and the question is indicated in the data whether they enrolled in the trial or not. So I need to identify that.
There are some claims data sets now, I think, that do have pretty good information. Like, I'm working with the Utah all-payer claims data, and there you have kind of census tract or census block.
But they don't have
tract.
an indicator whether they enrolled in the trial.
Oh, sure. I guess it would be diffuse because you kind of
I
have
just
some
did that.
population from the claims.
There's a CPT code that indicates participation in the trial, and a lot of private claims. Milani used this.
I don't call it.
The code exists, but is it used a lot?
Well, there was a paper that used this, and you might tell us how.
Yeah, I'll talk about it. That's good to know.
Very good to know.